In October of 1897, workmen expanding the foundation of what would become Richmond's new municipal hospital made a discovery that would shake Virginia's most prestigious medical establishment to its core. Beneath the manicured grounds of the former Fairfax estate, their shovels struck something that was decidedly not soil. The first skull emerged from the earth like a grotesque flower, its empty socket seeming to stare accusingly at the October sky. Within hours, the dig had revealed the remains of 37 individuals, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of surgical instruments and medical experimentation. The Virginia State Medical Board immediately sealed all records related to the discovery. Official reports claimed the remains were from a forgotten Confederate field hospital, casualties of the war that had simply been lost to time and poor record keeping. But those who worked that dig, those who saw the precise cuts in the bone, the systematic arrangement of the bodies, and the telltale signs of deliberate dismemberment, knew they had uncovered something far more sinister than battlefield casualties. Before we descend into this dark chapter of Virginia's hidden history, this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the most disturbing truths about America's medical past should continue. If you're ready to join our community of true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We're building a global network of people who refuse to let these stories remain buried. Dr. Edmund Fairfax had been dead for 3 years when his family's secrets began clawing their way out of the ground. In life, he had been Virginia's most celebrated physician, a man whose innovations in surgical technique had earned him accolades from medical institutions across the eastern seaboard. His estate in what is now downtown Richmond had been a pilgrimage site for aspiring doctors, a place where the finest minds in medicine gathered to witness procedures that pushed the boundaries of medical knowledge. The Fairfax name carried weight that extended far beyond the medical community. Edmund's grandfather had been among Virginia's founding families, a contemporary of Jefferson who had used his wealth and influence to establish some of the state's first hospitals and medical schools. The family's philanthropic efforts were legendary, their donations funding orphanages, poorhouses, and charitable medical clinics throughout the Commonwealth. When Dr. Edmund Fairfax spoke, medical professionals listened. When he recommended a treatment or procedure, it became standard practice. When he vouched for a colleague's character, careers were made. This reputation for medical excellence and charitable works made what investigators would eventually uncover all the more shocking. The Fairfax family had not simply been practicing medicine on their estate. They had been practicing something far more sinister, something that transformed healing into horror and turned their medical expertise into an instrument of systematic murder. The first hints that something was amiss had surfaced years before the mass grave was discovered, but the warnings came from sources that polite society was all too willing to ignore. In 1892, a freed slave named Samuel Washington had approached the Richmond police with tales of screaming coming from the Fairfax estate in the dead of night. He claimed to have seen wagons arriving under cover of darkness, loaded with what appeared to be unconscious individuals. The police dismissed his concerns, noting that Dr. Fairfax often treated patients at all hours and that the sounds Washington described were likely nothing more than the cries of patients undergoing necessary medical procedures. Similar reports trickled in over the following years. A postal worker mentioned the unusual volume of correspondence between the Fairfax estate and medical institutions as far away as Philadelphia and Boston. A local undertaker noted that Dr. Fairfax had been purchasing unusually large quantities of embalming fluid and coffins, far more than his legitimate practice could possibly require. Most disturbing of all, several families reported that relatives who had gone to Dr. Fairfax for treatment had simply vanished, with the doctor claiming they had been transferred to specialized facilities in other states. Each report was investigated with the perfunctory attention befitting complaints against one of Virginia's most respected citizens. Dr. Fairfax's explanations were accepted without question, his reputation serving as an impenetrable shield against suspicion. The missing patients had indeed been transferred, he would explain, though confidentiality prevented him from sharing details. The late-night arrivals were emergency cases that required immediate attention. The correspondence and supplies were for his extensive research into advanced surgical techniques. What investigators would later discover was that Dr. Edmund Fairfax had been operating what amounted to a human slaughterhouse disguised as a medical facility. His victims were chosen with calculating precision from society's most vulnerable populations. Immigrants seeking medical care found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Transient workers lured by promises of employment disappeared into the Fairfax estate never to be seen again. Orphans and street children, societies forgotten, became raw material for experiments that defied every principle of medical ethics. The scope of the Fairfax operation extended far beyond simple murder. This was systematic exploitation of human life for profit, a carefully orchestrated enterprise that transformed human beings into commodities. Bodies were harvested for organs that were sold to medical schools and private collectors. Skeletal remains were processed and distributed to educational institutions. Even hair, teeth, and skin were preserved and sold to manufacturers of medical supplies and educational materials. Dr. Fairfax had turned the noble profession of medicine into an assembly line of death, and he had done so with the tacit cooperation of a medical establishment that was either too corrupt or too willfully blind to question his methods. The implications of this conspiracy reached into the highest levels of Virginia society, implicating respected physicians, wealthy benefactors, and even government officials in a network of complicity that had enabled decades of systematic murder. The final pieces of evidence that would seal the fate of the Fairfax network emerged during the painstaking forensic examination of the estate's grounds in the weeks following the initial raid. Colonel Webb's team, working with federal investigators and independent medical experts, uncovered a systematic burial operation that revealed the true scope of the family's murderous enterprise. Using Rebecca O'Malley's detailed recollections of the estate's layout, investigators located multiple mass graves that contained the remains of victims spanning nearly 2 decades of systematic killing. The most significant discovery occurred when investigators followed O'Malley's description of a secluded area behind the estate's main laboratory where she had observed Thomas Fairfax disposing of what he called waste materials. Excavation of this site revealed a carefully organized cemetery containing the remains of over 100 individuals, their bodies arranged in numbered plots that corresponded to entries in Margaret's recovered ledgers. The systematic nature of this burial ground demonstrated the industrial scale of the family's murder operation. Forensic examination of the recovered remains provided irrefutable evidence of the torture and experimental procedures that victims had endured before death. Medical experts documented evidence of systematic organ removal, experimental surgical procedures, and deliberate dismemberment that served no legitimate medical purpose. The condition of the remains also revealed that many victims had been kept alive for extended periods while undergoing procedures that would have caused excruciating pain, confirming O'Malley's testimony about the family's methods. The investigation received crucial support from an unexpected source when Dr. Charles Whitmore, the son of the corrupt physician Henry Whitmore who had served as the network's primary recruiter, came forward with additional evidence that his father had attempted to destroy before the raid. The younger Whitmore had discovered his father's personal journals and correspondence hidden in the family home, documents that provided detailed accounts of victim recruitment methods and the psychological justifications that network participants had used to rationalize their crimes. As the walls were closing in on this monstrous operation, we're witnessing one of the most comprehensive criminal investigations in 19th-century America. The courage of survivors like Rebecca O'Malley and whistleblowers like Dr. Charles Whitmore reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, there are those willing to stand up for justice. If you're moved by these stories of resilience in the face of evil, share this video with others who appreciate the importance of remembering these hidden chapters of history. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to join our community dedicated to ensuring these stories are never forgotten. Edmund Fairfax's desperate attempts to escape justice reveal the extent of the network's international connections and the family's long-term contingency planning. Federal agents discovered that Edmund had maintained false identities and financial accounts in several European countries, along with detailed escape routes that would have allowed him to flee to locations where American law enforcement could not pursue him. His arrest while attempting to board a ship bound for Liverpool demonstrated the federal government's commitment to preventing any network participants from escaping accountability. The interrogation of captured network participants revealed the psychological mechanisms that had enabled respected medical professionals to participate in systematic murder for nearly 2 decades. Many participants claimed they had gradually been drawn into increasingly serious crimes, beginning with minor ethical violations and progressing to active participation in torture and murder. Others maintained that they had believed they were contributing to legitimate medical research, despite overwhelming evidence of the criminal nature of their activities. Margaret Fairfax's testimony, provided in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, offered the most comprehensive account of the network's operations and the institutional corruption that had protected it. Her detailed knowledge of financial transactions, victim processing procedures, and network participants provided federal prosecutors with evidence for hundreds of additional charges against dozens of individuals throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Margaret's cooperation also revealed the locations of additional burial sites and evidence caches that investigators had not yet discovered. The discovery of the network's client records revealed the complicity of numerous medical institutions and private collectors who had knowingly purchased specimens from what they understood to be an illegitimate source. Several prestigious medical schools were found to have been regular customers of the network, purchasing anatomical specimens at prices that should have raised questions about their origin. Private collectors, including wealthy individuals who displayed human remains as curiosities, were also implicated in the systematic market for murder victims. Thomas Fairfax's psychological evaluation, conducted by federal medical experts, revealed a level of mental conditioning and moral corruption that shocked experienced investigators. The evaluation documented how Thomas had been systematically trained from adolescence to view human beings as objects for experimentation, developing psychological mechanisms that allowed him to torture and murder without experiencing normal emotional responses. His case became one of the first documented examples of systematic psychological conditioning for criminal purposes. The investigation also uncovered evidence of the network's influence on medical education and practice throughout the region. Several medical schools had incorporated techniques and procedures developed through the network's illegal experimentation into their standard curricula, unknowingly teaching future physicians methods that had been perfected through systematic torture. The discovery of this institutional contamination raised questions about the ethical foundations of American medical education that would persist for decades. The federal investigation's reach extended beyond the immediate network participants to include corrupt officials and institutions that had enabled the operation through willful blindness or active participation. Dozens of judges, law enforcement officers, government officials, and medical professionals found themselves under federal investigation, with many facing charges ranging from corruption to accessory to murder. The systematic nature of this institutional compromise demonstrated how the network had been able to operate with virtual impunity for so long. Colonel Webb's final report on the investigation documented what federal prosecutors described as the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in American history up to that point. The network had combined medical expertise, institutional corruption, and systematic violence to create an operation that generated enormous profits while remaining hidden from public scrutiny for nearly 2 decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks might be operating in other regions, leading to expanded federal efforts to identify and prosecute comparable criminal enterprises. The legal proceedings that followed the exposure of the Fairfax network represented one of the most complex and far-reaching criminal prosecutions in American history. Federal prosecutors faced the daunting task of bringing justice for crimes that had been systematically concealed through nearly 2 decades of institutional corruption. The trials would ultimately involve over 80 defendants, hundreds of witnesses, and thousands of pieces of evidence documenting what the presiding judge described as an unprecedented conspiracy of murder and corruption. The prosecution's case was built around the meticulous documentation that Margaret Fairfax had maintained throughout the network's operation. Her ledgers provided detailed records of victim acquisitions, processing procedures, financial transactions, and correspondence with buyers that demonstrated the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. Combined with Rebecca O'Malley's eyewitness testimony and the physical evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes, prosecutors were able to construct a comprehensive narrative of the network's activities that left little room for doubt about the defendant's guilt. Edmund Fairfax's trial became the centerpiece of the prosecution's efforts, as his role as the network's leader made him responsible for the deaths of at least 200 confirmed victims. The prosecution presented evidence demonstrating that Edmund had not simply been conducting legitimate medical research that had gone wrong, but had deliberately created an operation designed to systematically murder vulnerable individuals for profit. His defense attorney's attempts to portray him as a dedicated physician whose research methods had been misunderstood were undermined by overwhelming evidence of premeditation and systematic cruelty. The most damaging testimony against Edmund came from surviving victims who had endured months or years of systematic torture while remaining conscious and aware of what was being done to them. These witnesses described procedures that served no legitimate medical purpose, conversations in which Edmund had discussed their economic value as specimens, and systematic efforts to prolong their suffering for experimental purposes. Their testimony revealed a man who had completely abandoned any pretense of medical ethics in pursuit of profit and sadistic satisfaction. Margaret Fairfax's decision to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for avoiding the death penalty provided crucial insight into the psychological and practical mechanisms that had enabled the network to operate for so long. Her testimony revealed how the family had gradually escalated from isolated killings to systematic murder, how they had identified and recruited corrupt officials, and how they had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for concealing their crimes. Margaret's detailed knowledge of network operations allowed prosecutors to understand the full scope of the conspiracy and identify additional participants who might otherwise have escaped justice. Thomas Fairfax's trial presented unique legal challenges due to his psychological conditioning and the circumstances of his participation in the network. Defense attorneys argued that Thomas had been systematically groomed from childhood to participate in criminal activities and could not be held fully responsible for crimes committed under such extreme psychological manipulation. However, prosecutors successfully demonstrated that Thomas had shown clear awareness of the criminal nature of his actions and had actively chosen to escalate his participation even when opportunities existed to withdraw from the network. The prosecution of corrupt officials who had enabled the network revealed the extent of institutional compromise that had protected the operation from investigation and prosecution. Judge Hartwell's trial demonstrated how the network had systematically corrupted Virginia's judicial system, while Sheriff Morrison's prosecution revealed the methods used to compromise law enforcement agencies. These trials exposed a level of systemic corruption that shocked the public and led to comprehensive reforms in oversight and accountability mechanisms for government officials. Dr. Harrison Mills's prosecution for his role in expanding the network into a regional operation revealed the sophisticated business methods that had been used to coordinate criminal activities across multiple states. Mills had developed distribution networks, pricing structures, and quality control procedures that had transformed isolated murders into a systematic commercial enterprise. His trial provided evidence of the network's connections to medical institutions throughout the Northeast and demonstrated how supposedly legitimate medical professionals had knowingly participated in systematic murder. The trials of medical institutions and private collectors who had purchased specimens from the network raised complex questions about institutional responsibility and willful ignorance. Several prestigious medical schools claimed they had not known the true source of anatomical specimens that they had purchased at suspiciously low prices over many years. However, prosecutors successfully argued that the quality, quantity, and pricing of these specimens should have raised obvious questions about their legitimate origin, making these institutions complicit in the network's crimes through willful blindness. The international implications of the network's activities became apparent when foreign governments demanded extradition of American citizens who had participated in exporting human remains to buyers in Canada and Europe. These diplomatic complications revealed that the network's reach had extended far beyond American borders and raised questions about similar operations that might exist in other countries. The international attention focused on the trials helped establish precedents for prosecuting transnational criminal enterprises involving human trafficking and systematic murder. The network's systematic elimination of witnesses and potential threats resulted in additional murder charges that demonstrated the calculating nature of the conspiracy. Prosecutors documented dozens of suspicious deaths that had occurred when individuals posed threats to the network's security, including journalists, investigators, and family members of victims who had asked too many questions. These elimination campaigns revealed a level of systematic violence that went beyond the network's primary murder operations and demonstrated the lengths to which participants would go to protect their criminal enterprise. The legal proceedings also revealed the broader implications of the network's activities for American medical practice and education. Several medical techniques and procedures that had been developed through illegal experimentation were being taught at medical schools and used by practicing physicians who were unaware of their criminal origins. This contamination of legitimate medical knowledge raised ethical questions that would influence medical education and research protocols for decades to come, leading to the establishment of formal ethical review processes and oversight mechanisms that had not previously existed. The final judgments rendered in the Fairfax Network trials marked a watershed moment in American criminal justice and medical ethics. On March 17, 1897, Edmund Fairfax was sentenced to death by electric chair, becoming one of the first individuals executed using Virginia's newly adopted method of capital punishment. His execution, carried out on October 15, 1897, drew crowds of thousands who gathered outside the Richmond City Jail to witness what newspapers described as justice for the most heinous crimes in Virginia's history. Margaret Fairfax received a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, a decision that reflected both her crucial cooperation with prosecutors and the unprecedented nature of her crimes. She would spend the remaining 23 years of her life in the Virginia State Penitentiary, where she continued to provide information to investigators pursuing similar cases in other states. Margaret's meticulous record-keeping abilities, which had enabled the network's success, ultimately proved essential to understanding the full scope of systematic murder operations throughout the United States. Thomas Fairfax's sentencing presented unique challenges for a legal system unprepared to address the psychological conditioning and systematic indoctrination that had shaped his participation in the network. After extensive psychological evaluation and legal debate, Thomas received a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. However, his complete inability to demonstrate genuine remorse or understanding of his crimes led to repeated denials of parole, and he would die in prison in 1934 at the age of 57. The broader network prosecutions resulted in convictions for 73 additional defendants, with sentences ranging from lengthy prison terms to execution for those who had played central roles in systematic murder. Judge Hartwell was stripped of his judicial position and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, while Sheriff Morrison received a 15-year sentence for corruption and accessory to murder. Dr. Mills was executed in Pennsylvania after being extradited to face charges for murders committed in that state. The investigation's impact extended far beyond individual prosecutions to encompass sweeping reforms in medical education, research oversight, and government accountability. The American Medical Association, responding to public outrage over the network's activities, established the first formal ethical review boards for medical research and created mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious deaths in medical facilities. These reforms, known collectively as the Fairfax Protocols, became the foundation for modern medical ethics oversight and informed consent procedures. The exposure of the network's systematic corruption of government officials led to comprehensive reforms in oversight and accountability mechanisms throughout Virginia and other affected states. New requirements for financial disclosure by judges and law enforcement officers, along with independent oversight boards for investigating corruption allegations, were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic institutional compromise that had enabled the network to operate with impunity. Rebecca O'Malley's courageous testimony and survival became a symbol of resilience in the face of systematic evil, inspiring legislation to protect victims and witnesses in criminal proceedings. The O'Malley Act, passed by Congress in 1898, established federal protections for witnesses in major criminal cases, and created victim compensation programs that provided financial support for individuals who had suffered crimes of unusual severity. O'Malley herself received a substantial settlement from the federal government and used the funds to establish charitable organizations serving immigrant communities. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey through one of America's darkest chapters, it's important to remember that the courage of survivors like Rebecca O'Malley and investigators like Colonel Webb ultimately brought justice where institutional corruption had failed. Their determination to expose the truth reminds us why we must never forget these stories, no matter how disturbing they may be. What are your thoughts on this chilling tale of medical horror and the pursuit of justice? Share your reflections in the comments below, and if this investigation into America's hidden past has captivated you, subscribe and hit that notification bell to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried. The international implications of the network's activities led to diplomatic agreements between the United States and several European countries regarding the regulation and oversight of anatomical specimen trade. These agreements established inspection protocols and documentation requirements that made it significantly more difficult for similar criminal enterprises to operate across international borders. The precedents established by these diplomatic initiatives influenced international law regarding human trafficking and systematic murder for decades to come. The medical institutions that had unknowingly purchased specimens from the network faced ongoing scrutiny and reform requirements that fundamentally changed how anatomical materials were acquired and used in medical education. Several prominent medical schools were forced to completely restructure their anatomy programs and implement new ethical guidelines for specimen acquisition. The contamination of medical knowledge through criminal experimentation led to comprehensive reviews of established procedures and techniques, resulting in the abandonment of several practices that had been developed through systematic torture. The psychological impact of the network's exposure on Virginia's medical community was profound and lasting. Many legitimate physicians struggled with the realization that their profession had been systematically corrupted by individuals who had perverted medical knowledge for criminal purposes. This crisis of confidence led to increased emphasis on ethical training in medical education and the establishment of professional organizations dedicated to maintaining the integrity of medical practice. The Fairfax estate itself was demolished in 1899, with the grounds converted into a public memorial park dedicated to the victims of the network's crimes. The memorial, which includes individual markers for each identified victim, serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of vigilance against the corruption of trusted institutions. Annual memorial services continue to be held at the site, attended by descendants of victims and members of communities that were affected by the network's activities. The legacy of the Fairfax network prosecutions influenced American criminal justice procedures for generations, establishing precedents for prosecuting complex conspiracy cases and protecting victims and witnesses in major criminal proceedings. The comprehensive nature of the investigation and the systematic approach to gathering evidence became a model for federal law enforcement agencies pursuing other large-scale criminal enterprises. The case also demonstrated the importance of independent oversight and federal intervention when local corruption compromises the pursuit of justice. The broader lessons learned from the Fairfax network's activities continue to influence discussions about medical ethics, institutional accountability, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of the crimes and the institutional corruption that enabled them serve as permanent reminders of the need for vigilance and transparency in institutions that hold power over individual lives and welfare. The Fairfax family's descent into systematic murder had not happened overnight. It was a gradual corruption that began with legitimate medical ambition and slowly transformed into something monstrous. To understand how respected healers became calculating killers, one must first understand the world in which they operated and the forces that shaped their twisted enterprise. Edmund Fairfax had inherited more than just wealth and social standing from his family. He had inherited a legacy of medical innovation that stretched back 3 generations. His great-grandfather, Dr. Josiah Fairfax, had been among the first physicians in Virginia to advocate for the systematic study of human anatomy through dissection. In the 1820s, when such practices were still viewed with suspicion and often banned by local authorities, Josiah had quietly established one of the first private anatomical schools in the South. The family's medical dynasty had been built on a foundation of pushing boundaries and challenging conventional wisdom. Edmund's father, Dr. Marcus Fairfax, had expanded the family's influence by establishing connections with medical schools throughout the eastern seaboard. He had been instrumental in lobbying for legislation that would make it easier for medical institutions to obtain cadavers for educational purposes, arguing that the advancement of medical science required a steady supply of subjects for study. By the time Edmund inherited the family practice in 1875, the Fairfax name was synonymous with medical excellence and progressive thinking. The family estate had been transformed into a private medical compound, complete with operating theatres, laboratories, and housing for visiting physicians and medical students. What appeared to be a legitimate educational institution was, in reality, the perfect cover for activities that would have horrified the medical community had they been exposed. Edmund's wife, Margaret Fairfax, was far more than simply the spouse of a prominent physician. She had been educated at one of the few medical colleges that accepted women, though social conventions prevented her from practicing medicine openly. Instead, she channeled her knowledge and skills into managing the practical aspects of her husband's operations. Margaret maintained meticulous records of every procedure, every patient, and every transaction that occurred on the estate. Her ledgers, which would later become crucial evidence in the investigation, revealed a mind that approached murder with the same systematic precision that others might apply to running a hospital. The Fairfax operation required a network of accomplices and enablers, individuals who either actively participated in the crimes or willfully ignored evidence of wrongdoing. Dr. Henry Whitmore, Edmund's longtime colleague and closest friend, served as the operation's primary recruiter. Whitmore's legitimate medical practice in Richmond's poorest neighborhoods provided him with access to the city's most vulnerable populations. Patients who came to him seeking treatment for minor ailments often found themselves referred to Dr. Fairfax for specialized care that they would never receive. The family's youngest member, Thomas Fairfax, represented the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. Edmund's son had been raised in an environment where human life was treated as a commodity, where the screams of victims were dismissed as the unavoidable sounds of medical progress. By the age of 16, Thomas was actively participating in procedures that would have horrified seasoned physicians. He had been taught to view their victims not as human beings deserving of compassion, but as raw materials necessary for the advancement of science. The Fairfax family had also cultivated relationships with corrupt officials throughout Virginia's government and law enforcement communities. Sheriff James Morrison had been receiving regular payments from the family for nearly a decade, payments that ensured any complaints or investigations would be handled with minimal scrutiny. Judge William Hartwell, who presided over the county court, had been a frequent guest at the Fairfax estate and had witnessed enough of their activities to make him a willing participant in covering up their crimes. Even the local religious community had been compromised. Reverend David Ashford, pastor of Richmond's most prestigious Presbyterian church, had been conducting private burial services for the Fairfax family for years. These services were ostensibly for patients who had died during treatment, but the Reverend had been paid handsomely to ask no questions about the circumstances of these deaths or the unusual frequency with which they occurred. The transformation of the Fairfax family from healers to killers had been facilitated by a medical establishment that prioritized reputation and profit over patient welfare. The late 19th century was a time of rapid advancement in medical knowledge, but it was also a period when oversight and regulation were virtually non-existent. Physicians operated with almost complete autonomy, their decisions rarely questioned by colleagues or authorities. This environment of unchecked authority provided the perfect conditions for the kind of systematic abuse that the Fairfax family would perfect over the course of 2 decades. The systematic murder operation that would eventually claim dozens of lives began with what Edmund Fairfax convinced himself were acts of mercy. In the winter of 1878, a homeless man suffering from advanced tuberculosis had been brought to the estate by one of Dr. Whitmore's assistants. The man was dying, his condition beyond any hope of recovery, and Edmund made the decision to end his suffering with a lethal dose of morphine. What should have been an isolated act of euthanasia became the first step down a path that would lead to systematic slaughter. Edmund's journal entries from this period, discovered decades later hidden behind a false wall in the estate's library, reveal a man struggling to justify increasingly heinous acts through twisted medical philosophy. He wrote extensively about the burden of treating patients who could never be cured, about the waste of medical resources on individuals who contributed nothing to society. Gradually, his writings began to reflect a belief that eliminating these undesirable patients was not only justified but necessary for the greater good of medical advancement. Margaret Fairfax proved to be the perfect partner for her husband's evolving methodology. Where Edmund provided the medical expertise and philosophical justification, Margaret contributed organizational skills that transformed isolated killings into an efficient operation. She developed a system for categorizing potential victims based on their social connections, financial resources, and likelihood of being missed. Transient workers received the highest priority, followed by recent immigrants with limited English skills and no local family connections. The first deliberate murder for profit occurred in the spring of 1879. A German immigrant named Klaus Weber had come to the estate seeking treatment for a broken arm sustained in a factory accident. Weber was traveling alone, carried a substantial amount of cash, and spoke limited English. Margaret's records indicate that Weber was kept sedated for 3 days while the family debated his fate. Edmund eventually decided that Weber's isolation and financial resources made him an ideal candidate for what he euphemistically termed advanced experimental procedures. Weber's death established the template that the Fairfax family would follow for the next 18 years. The victim was kept alive for several days while various experimental procedures were performed, ostensibly to advance medical knowledge but actually to prolong the profitable harvesting of organs and body parts. Weber's skeletal remains were eventually sold to the Medical College of Virginia for $30, a substantial sum that helped Edmund rationalize the murder as a necessary source of funding for legitimate medical research. The success of Weber's murder emboldened the family to expand their operations. Dr. Whitmore began actively recruiting potential victims from among his charity patients, offering free advanced treatment at the Fairfax estate. These offers were particularly attractive to individuals suffering from chronic conditions that required expensive ongoing care. Patients who accepted Whitmore's referrals found themselves transported to the estate in closed carriages, usually under heavy sedation that was described as necessary preparation for specialized procedures. Thomas Fairfax's initiation into the family business occurred when he was just 14 years old. Edmund believed that exposing his son to the realities of their operation was essential preparation for eventually inheriting the enterprise. Thomas's first victim was a young Irish woman named Bridget O'Sullivan who had been seeking treatment for complications following childbirth. Edmund forced his son to assist in procedures that gradually dismembered the woman while she remained conscious and aware of what was happening to her. The psychological impact of this experience on Thomas was profound and disturbing. Rather than being traumatized by witnessing systematic torture and murder, the boy seemed to embrace the power that came with controlling life and death. Margaret's journals note with apparent pride that Thomas showed remarkable composure during procedures and demonstrated an intuitive understanding of which victims were likely to provide the most valuable anatomical specimens. By 1881, the Fairfax operation had evolved into a sophisticated enterprise with multiple revenue streams. Bodies were sold intact to medical schools for dissection classes. Individual organs were preserved and distributed to private collectors and research institutions. Skeletal remains were processed and sold to educational supply companies. Even hair, teeth, and skin were harvested and sold to manufacturers of wigs, dental appliances, and medical training materials. The family had also developed relationships with several funeral homes and mortuaries throughout Virginia and neighboring states. These establishments would purchase partially dissected remains and prepare them for burial with false death certificates provided by corrupt physicians in the Fairfax network. This arrangement allowed the family to dispose of evidence while generating additional revenue from what would otherwise have been waste products. Edmund's growing confidence in the operation led him to take increasingly bold risks. He began accepting contracts from medical institutions that needed specific types of specimens for research or educational purposes. A request from Johns Hopkins for the brain of a young adult male led to the murder of a promising medical student from the University of Virginia. An order for female reproductive organs resulted in the deaths of 3 women who had sought treatment for gynecological conditions. The systematic nature of these crimes was masked by the family's continued reputation for legitimate medical practice. Edmund continued to treat paying patients, often performing genuinely beneficial procedures that enhanced his standing in the medical community. This legitimate practice provided perfect cover for the murders, as the estate's facilities appeared to be operating as a normal medical institution to any casual observer. By the mid-1880s, the Fairfax family had refined their victim selection process into a science as precise as any legitimate medical procedure. Margaret's meticulous record-keeping had identified patterns in successful acquisitions, leading to the development of what she termed procurement protocols that maximized profit while minimizing risk of discovery. These protocols represented a chilling evolution from opportunistic murder to systematic predation. The family's preferred targets fell into distinct categories, each chosen for specific advantages they offered to the operation. Traveling salesmen and itinerant workers topped the list, as their transient nature meant extended absences were expected and rarely investigated. Edmund had developed relationships with several boarding houses and hotels that catered to this population, paying modest fees to proprietors who would notify him when particularly suitable candidates checked in. Recent immigrants comprised the second tier of preferred victims. Language barriers made these individuals particularly vulnerable, as they often struggled to communicate their whereabouts to family members or understand the true nature of what was happening to them. The Fairfax operation had cultivated connections with corrupt immigration officials who provided advance notice of new arrivals, particularly those traveling alone or with minimal financial resources. Orphans and abandoned children represented the most disturbing category of victims, chosen specifically because their disappearances were least likely to trigger serious investigations. Edmund had established partnerships with several overwhelmed orphanages throughout Virginia and neighboring states, offering to provide advanced medical care for children with chronic conditions or developmental disabilities. These institutions, struggling with limited resources and overcrowding, were grateful for any assistance that reduced their burdens. The family's victim selection process had become so sophisticated that they maintained detailed profiles of potential targets, including physical characteristics, medical history, and estimated market value of various body parts. Margaret's ledgers revealed that healthy young adults commanded the highest prices, with their organs fetching premium rates from medical institutions conducting advanced research. Children's remains were particularly valuable to educational institutions teaching pediatric medicine, while elderly victims were processed primarily for their skeletal remains. The methodology for acquiring victims had evolved far beyond Dr. Whitmore's initial charity patient referrals. The family had developed an elaborate network of recruiters who operated throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. These recruiters, often posing as legitimate medical professionals or charitable workers, would identify suitable candidates and arrange for their transportation to the Fairfax estate under various pretexts. One particularly effective recruitment strategy involved offering free medical examinations to workers in dangerous industries such as mining, logging, and factory work. These examinations were conducted at temporary facilities set up near work sites, with the most suitable candidates being selected for follow-up treatment at the estate. Workers who accepted these offers were typically told they had conditions requiring immediate specialized care that could only be provided by Dr. Fairfax's advanced facilities. The transportation of victims to the estate had been systematized to minimize the risk of witnesses or escape attempts. A specially modified wagon with a concealed compartment had been constructed to transport sedated victims during daylight hours. For longer distances, the family had arranged partnerships with railroad employees who would ensure that unconscious passengers were loaded into private compartments without attracting attention. Once victims arrived at the estate, they were processed through a system that Edmund had designed to maximize both the duration of their suffering and the value of their remains. The basement levels of the main building had been converted into a series of holding cells and surgical suites that could accommodate multiple victims simultaneously. Each cell was equipped with restraints and monitoring equipment that allowed the family to maintain victims in various states of consciousness depending on the procedures being performed. The family had also developed sophisticated preservation techniques that allowed them to maintain harvested organs and tissues for extended periods. A specially constructed cold storage facility used ice imported from northern states to keep specimens fresh during transportation to buyers. This innovation significantly expanded their market reach, as they could now supply institutions hundreds of miles away without concerns about spoilage. Edmund's surgical techniques had evolved to prioritize the preservation of valuable specimens over the quick death of victims. He had developed methods for keeping patients alive while systematically removing organs, allowing for the harvesting of multiple specimens from a single individual. These procedures, which could last for days, represented a level of systematic cruelty that exceeded anything previously documented in American criminal history. The family's growing expertise in human anatomy had led to the development of specialized processing techniques for different types of remains. Adult skeletons were carefully articulated and prepared for educational use, while children's remains were often preserved intact for pediatric training programs. Organs were categorized by quality and preservation requirements, with the most valuable specimens receiving elaborate preparation to ensure their suitability for advanced research. Margaret had also established quality control procedures that ensured all products met the specifications required by their buyers. She maintained detailed records of which institutions preferred specific types of specimens and had developed packaging and shipping methods that guaranteed delivery in optimal condition. This attention to detail had earned the Fairfax operation a reputation for reliability among their corrupt network of buyers, leading to repeat orders and premium pricing for their products. The years between 1885 and 1890 marked the height of the Fairfax family's murderous enterprise, a period when their operation expanded beyond anything Edmund had originally envisioned. What had begun as isolated killings for financial gain had evolved into a sophisticated network that supplied human remains to medical institutions across multiple states. The family's success had attracted the attention of other corrupt physicians and businessmen, leading to the formation of what investigators would later describe as the first organized body trafficking syndicate in American history. The expansion began when Dr. Harrison Mills, a prominent surgeon from Philadelphia, approached Edmund with a proposition that would transform their local operation into a regional enterprise. Mills had been purchasing specimens from the Fairfax operation for several years and had observed the superior quality of their products compared to other suppliers. He proposed the creation of a formal partnership that would coordinate the activities of corrupt physicians throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, creating a network capable of supplying the growing demand from medical schools and research institutions. If this chilling expansion of organized murder is sending shivers down your spine, you're not alone in recognizing the horror of what these respected medical professionals became. Share this video with friends who appreciate dark historical mysteries, hit that like button to support our deep dive into America's hidden past, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories that reveal the truth behind our sanitized history books. The partnership that Mills proposed represented a quantum leap in the scale and sophistication of their criminal enterprise. Rather than operating as an isolated family business, the Fairfax operation would become the central hub of a network that included corrupt physicians in Baltimore, Washington, Richmond, and Norfolk. Each partner would contribute their local expertise and resources while sharing in the profits generated by the expanded operation. Margaret Fairfax embraced this expansion with characteristic organizational precision. She developed a complex system of coded correspondence that allowed the network partners to communicate about victims, procedures, and shipments without creating obvious evidence of their criminal activities. Her ledgers from this period reveal a woman who managed the logistics of systematic murder with the same attention to detail that others might apply to running a legitimate business. The network's expansion required significant investment in infrastructure and personnel. The Fairfax estate underwent major renovations that doubled the capacity of their processing facilities. New holding cells were constructed to accommodate the increased volume of victims, while expanded laboratory and preservation facilities allowed for more sophisticated processing of remains. The family also invested in a private railroad spur that connected the estate directly to the main Richmond to Washington line, facilitating the discreet shipment of products to buyers throughout the region. Thomas Fairfax, now in his early 20s, had become an integral part of the expanding operation. His years of experience in the family business had transformed him into a skilled practitioner of systematic murder, capable of managing multiple victims simultaneously while maintaining the precise documentation that Margaret demanded. Thomas had also demonstrated a talent for recruitment, developing innovative methods for identifying and acquiring suitable victims from increasingly diverse populations. One of Thomas's most successful innovations involved the establishment of fake charitable medical clinics in impoverished neighborhoods throughout Virginia and Maryland. These clinics, staffed by corrupt physicians in the network, offered free treatment for conditions that supposedly required specialized care available only at the Fairfax estate. Patients who accepted referrals to these advanced treatment facilities found themselves transported to the estate in specially modified ambulances that served as mobile prisons. The network's success had also attracted the attention of international buyers, particularly medical schools in Canada and Europe that were willing to pay premium prices for high-quality specimens. Edmund had established relationships with corrupt shipping companies that could transport preserved remains across international borders without attracting customs scrutiny. These international sales represented the most profitable aspect of the entire operation, with individual specimens sometimes generating hundreds of dollars in revenue. The family's growing wealth and influence had also enabled them to corrupt additional officials and institutions throughout Virginia. Sheriff Morrison's replacement, Captain William Bradley, had been recruited into the network within months of taking office. Judge Hartwell had been promoted to the state Supreme Court, where his influence could protect the operation from higher-level investigations. Even the state medical examiner, Dr. Robert Thornton, had become a paid participant who ensured that any suspicious deaths connected to network activities would be ruled accidental or natural. The sophistication of the network's operations during this period is perhaps best illustrated by their development of what they termed custom procurement services. Wealthy private collectors and research institutions could place specific orders for particular types of specimens, with the network guaranteeing delivery within specified timeframes. These custom orders often commanded extraordinary prices, with rare specimens or those requiring specific preparation techniques generating thousands of dollars in revenue. One particularly lucrative custom order came from a private collector in Boston who was assembling what he claimed was an educational display of human anatomical variations. The collector's specifications were extraordinarily detailed, requiring specimens from individuals of specific ages, ethnicities, and physical characteristics. Fulfilling this order required the network to murder more than 20 people over the course of 6 months, but the payment of $15,000 made it the most profitable single transaction in the operation's history. The network had also developed relationships with several corrupt funeral homes and cemeteries that provided additional revenue streams and disposal methods for evidence. These establishments would accept partially processed remains and provide burial services with falsified death certificates, while also serving as sources for additional victims among individuals who had died of natural causes but whose bodies could be harvested before burial. The unprecedented success of the Fairfax network inevitably attracted unwanted attention, forcing the family to confront the reality that their expanding operation was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The first serious threat emerged in late 1890 when a Baltimore newspaper began investigating the mysterious disappearances of several immigrants who had last been seen seeking medical treatment at network-affiliated clinics. The investigation, led by reporter James Mitchell, represented the kind of sustained scrutiny that could unravel decades of carefully constructed lies and corrupted officials. Mitchell's investigation had been triggered by the persistence of Maria Santos, a Portuguese immigrant whose brother had vanished after being referred to what he believed was a charitable medical facility. Santos had spent months visiting police stations and newspaper offices, desperately seeking anyone who would listen to her concerns about her brother's disappearance. Most officials dismissed her complaints, citing language barriers and the transient nature of immigrant communities. Mitchell, however, recognized patterns in her story that suggested something more sinister than simple medical malpractice. The reporter's initial inquiries revealed that Santos's brother was not an isolated case. Over the previous 5 years, at least 30 individuals had disappeared after seeking treatment at clinics that claimed affiliation with Dr. Edmund Fairfax's renowned medical facilities. Mitchell's investigation uncovered a network of fake charitable clinics that operated in immigrant neighborhoods throughout Maryland and Virginia, all claiming to provide free advanced medical care for serious conditions. Edmund Fairfax's response to this threat demonstrated the calculating ruthlessness that had enabled his operation to flourish for over a decade. Rather than attempting to discredit Mitchell through legal channels or public pressure, Edmund decided that the reporter posed too significant a risk to be allowed to continue his investigation. Margaret's ledgers reveal detailed discussions about eliminating Mitchell, with the family ultimately deciding that his death needed to appear completely unrelated to medical practice to avoid connecting it to their operation. The murder of James Mitchell was carried out with characteristic precision by Thomas Fairfax, who had developed expertise in eliminating threats to the family business. Mitchell was approached by an individual posing as a potential source with information about the medical clinic investigation. The meeting was arranged at a remote location outside Baltimore, where Thomas and 2 network associates subdued the reporter and transported him to a secondary processing facility that the network had established specifically for handling sensitive eliminations. Mitchell's death was staged to appear as the result of a robbery gone wrong, with his body discovered several days later in an alley known for criminal activity. The Baltimore police investigation concluded that the reporter had been killed during a failed mugging attempt, a conclusion that was accepted without question by Mitchell's newspaper colleagues. The investigation into the medical clinic disappearances died with Mitchell, as no other journalist was willing to pursue a story that had apparently cost their colleague his life. The success in eliminating the Mitchell threat emboldened the family to take more aggressive measures against other potential sources of exposure. Margaret had compiled a comprehensive list of individuals whose knowledge or suspicions posed risks to the operation, including former employees, family members of victims, and officials who had not been sufficiently corrupted to guarantee their silence. This list became the foundation for a systematic campaign of intimidation and elimination that would claim at least a dozen additional lives over the following 2 years. The family security measures extended beyond simply eliminating threats to include comprehensive surveillance of anyone who might pose a future danger. Edmund had recruited several private investigators and corrupt law enforcement officers who monitored the activities of suspicious individuals and reported any concerning developments. This surveillance network provided early warning of potential investigations while also identifying opportunities to recruit new participants or eliminate emerging threats. One of the most elaborate security measures involved the creation of false identities and documentation for key network participants. Margaret had established relationships with corrupt officials in vital records offices throughout multiple states, enabling the creation of complete fictional backgrounds for family members and associates. These false identities provided escape routes in case the operation was exposed, while also facilitating the movement of personnel and resources without creating obvious connections to the Fairfax name. The family had also developed contingency plans for destroying evidence in case of imminent exposure. The estate's laboratory and processing facilities were equipped with incendiary devices that could completely destroy all equipment and documentation within minutes. Similar destruction capabilities had been installed at secondary facilities throughout the network, ensuring that physical evidence of their activities could be eliminated before investigators could secure crime scenes. Thomas Fairfax had become particularly skilled at witness elimination, developing methods that could make deaths appear accidental or natural while ensuring that potential witnesses were silenced before they could share dangerous information. His techniques included poisoning methods that mimicked natural illnesses, staged accidents that appeared genuinely accidental, and intimidation tactics that convinced potential witnesses to relocate far from areas where they might encounter investigators. The network's growing paranoia about security had also led to increased internal surveillance and loyalty testing of participants. Margaret had implemented systems for monitoring the communications and activities of network members, looking for signs of potential betrayal or carelessness that could expose the operation. Several longtime participants were eliminated during this period after exhibiting behavior that the family deemed insufficiently cautious or loyal. Despite these extensive security measures, the Fairfax family was beginning to recognize that their operation had grown beyond their ability to completely control all potential sources of exposure. The network's success had created too many participants, too many transactions, and too many opportunities for mistakes that could trigger investigations they might not be able to contain or eliminate. The appointment of Colonel Marcus Webb as Virginia's new state inspector of medical facilities in January 1893 marked the beginning of the end for the Fairfax family's murderous enterprise. Webb, a former Union Army surgeon who had distinguished himself during the Civil War, brought a level of systematic investigation and incorruptible integrity that the family's network had never before encountered. Unlike his predecessor, who had been content to accept cursory explanations and monetary inducements, Webb possessed both the medical expertise to recognize irregularities and the investigative experience to pursue them relentlessly. Webb's first official inspection of the Fairfax estate occurred in March 1893, ostensibly as part of a routine review of Virginia's private medical facilities. However, the inspection had actually been prompted by a confidential report from Dr. Sarah Henderson, one of the few female physicians practicing in Richmond, who had noticed disturbing patterns in the medical supply market. Henderson had observed that certain anatomical specimens were being offered for sale with unusual frequency and quality, suggesting a source that went beyond normal mortality rates. What Dr. Henderson had discovered was that the Fairfax network had become so successful that their products were flooding the regional market for medical specimens. Educational institutions that had previously struggled to obtain adequate supplies for their anatomy classes were suddenly being offered more specimens than they could possibly use. The quality and preservation of these specimens was also exceptional, far superior to what would normally be expected from natural deaths or legitimate medical procedures. This story is getting intense, isn't it? The walls were closing in on one of the most sophisticated murder networks in American history. If you're as captivated by this dark chapter of medical history as our growing community of truth seekers, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We're building a global network of people who refuse to let these horrific stories remain buried. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's hidden past. Webb's initial inspection of the Fairfax estate revealed several irregularities that raised immediate suspicions. The facility's capacity for processing anatomical specimens far exceeded what would be necessary for the legitimate research activities that Edmund claimed to be conducting. The preservation equipment was more sophisticated than what most major medical schools possessed, and the volume of shipping material suggested a commercial operation rather than an educational institution. Most concerning to Webb was the discovery of detailed records that documented the processing and distribution of human remains with a level of precision that seemed inconsistent with legitimate medical research. Margaret's meticulous record-keeping, which had been essential to the operation's success, became a liability when examined by someone with Webb's investigative skills. The records revealed patterns of specimen acquisition and processing that could not be explained by normal mortality rates or legitimate medical procedures. Webb's military background had taught him to recognize the signs of systematic deception and institutional corruption. During his inspection, he noted that several estate employees exhibited behaviors consistent with individuals involved in criminal activities. They were evasive when questioned about their duties, reluctant to provide access to certain areas of the facility, and overly deferential in ways that suggested fear rather than respect for authority. The colonel's suspicions were further aroused by Edmund Fairfax's reaction to the inspection. Rather than welcoming the opportunity to showcase his supposedly legitimate research activities, Edmund appeared nervous and defensive. He attempted to limit Webb's access to certain areas of the estate, claiming that ongoing experiments required absolute sterility that could be compromised by unauthorized personnel. These restrictions only served to increase Webb's determination to conduct a more thorough investigation. Following his initial inspection, Webb began a discreet investigation into the broader network of medical facilities and suppliers that were connected to the Fairfax operation. His military contacts provided access to federal resources and investigative capabilities that state-level corruption could not compromise. Webb discovered that similar irregularities existed at medical facilities throughout Virginia and Maryland, all connected through a web of professional relationships and financial transactions centered on the Fairfax estate. The colonel's investigation received unexpected assistance from an unlikely source when Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the daughter of the corrupt former sheriff, approached him with information about her father's relationship with the Fairfax family. Morrison had discovered evidence among her father's papers indicating that he had been receiving regular payments from the Fairfax estate for services that were never clearly defined in official records. Her father's sudden wealth and his mysterious late-night meetings with Edmund Fairfax had troubled her for years. Webb's investigation also benefited from the growing concerns of legitimate medical professionals who had begun to question the source and quality of specimens being offered for sale throughout the region. Several prominent physicians had noticed that the anatomical materials being distributed by Fairfax-affiliated suppliers bore evidence of advanced preservation techniques and surgical precision that exceeded what would normally be available from natural deaths or routine medical procedures. The network's attempts to monitor and intimidate Webb proved unsuccessful due to his military training and federal connections. Several attempts to compromise the colonel through bribery or blackmail failed when he reported these approaches to federal authorities. The family's usual methods of eliminating threats were also ineffective against someone with Webb's security awareness and institutional protections. As Webb's investigation expanded, it began to uncover evidence of corruption that extended far beyond the Fairfax family into the highest levels of Virginia's medical and legal establishments. Judge Hartwell's financial records revealed payments from multiple sources connected to the network, while Dr. Thornton's activities as state medical examiner showed a pattern of suspicious rulings that had protected network operations from scrutiny. The colonel's methodical approach to building his case ensured that the evidence he gathered would be sufficient to overcome the institutional corruption that had protected the network for so many years. Rather than rushing to make arrests or public accusations, Webb carefully documented every aspect of the operation while building relationships with federal prosecutors who could not be compromised by local political influences. The breakthrough in Colonel Webb's investigation came from an unexpected source in the autumn of 1894. Rebecca O'Malley, a young Irish woman who had been presumed dead for nearly 2 years, appeared at the Richmond police station with a story that would provide the first eyewitness testimony to the horrors that had been occurring at the Fairfax estate. O'Malley's survival was nothing short of miraculous, the result of a series of fortunate circumstances that had allowed her to escape from what she described as a living hell disguised as a medical facility. O'Malley had been working as a seamstress in Baltimore when she developed symptoms that a corrupt clinic physician diagnosed as a serious heart condition requiring immediate specialized treatment. She was told that Dr. Edmund Fairfax was the only physician in the region capable of performing the advanced surgery necessary to save her life. Trusting in the supposed expertise of the medical establishment, O'Malley had agreed to be transported to the Fairfax estate for treatment that she believed would cure her condition. Instead of receiving medical care, O'Malley found herself imprisoned in the estate's basement facilities alongside dozens of other victims in various stages of the systematic torture and dismemberment that the Fairfax family called medical research. She witnessed procedures that defied every principle of medical ethics, watching as fellow prisoners were subjected to experimental surgeries designed not to heal but to prolong suffering while harvesting valuable anatomical specimens. O'Malley's survival had been the result of pure chance combined with remarkable resilience and intelligence. During a procedure in which Thomas Fairfax was attempting to remove one of her kidneys while keeping her conscious to observe her reactions, a fire had broken out in an adjacent laboratory due to overheated preservation equipment. In the confusion that followed, O'Malley had managed to break free from her restraints and escape through a basement window that had been left open to provide ventilation during the emergency. The young woman had spent nearly 6 months recovering from her injuries while hiding in the homes of sympathetic Irish immigrant families who were too frightened of authorities to report her presence. During this time, O'Malley had suffered from severe infections, malnutrition, and psychological trauma that left her barely able to function. Only the persistent encouragement of Father Patrick McNamara, a Catholic priest who ministered to the immigrant community, had finally convinced her to share her story with law enforcement. Colonel Webb immediately recognized the significance of O'Malley's testimony and took extraordinary measures to protect her from the Fairfax family's network of corrupt officials and elimination specialists. She was placed under federal protection and relocated to a secure facility outside Virginia where she could provide detailed testimony without fear of retribution. Webb also arranged for medical examination by independent physicians who documented the extensive surgical scars and other evidence that corroborated her account of systematic torture. O'Malley's detailed knowledge of the estate's layout and operations provided Webb with crucial intelligence for planning a comprehensive raid that could gather evidence before the family could destroy it. She described the location of holding cells, laboratory facilities, preservation equipment, and document storage areas with precision that could only come from first-hand experience. Her testimony also provided the first detailed accounts of specific individuals who had been murdered, including names, descriptions, and circumstances that Webb could use to identify other victims. The survivor's account also revealed the full extent of the psychological conditioning and indoctrination that had allowed the Fairfax family to maintain their operation for so many years. O'Malley described how Edmund Fairfax would lecture victims about their contribution to medical science while subjecting them to procedures that served no legitimate research purpose. She recounted Thomas Fairfax's obvious enjoyment of inflicting pain and his casual discussions of which victims would provide the most valuable specimens. Webb's investigation received additional corroboration when O'Malley's testimony prompted several other potential witnesses to come forward with information about missing family members and friends. The Irish immigrant community, emboldened by O'Malley's courage and Webb's obvious commitment to justice, began sharing stories that had been suppressed by fear and mistrust of authorities. These accounts revealed a pattern of disappearances stretching back over a decade, with victims consistently being last seen seeking medical treatment from Fairfax-affiliated practitioners. The Colonel's team also discovered physical evidence that supported O'Malley's testimony when they located the abandoned basement window through which she had escaped. The area around the window showed signs of recent repairs and concealment efforts, suggesting that the family had attempted to eliminate evidence of the security breach. Soil samples from the escape route contained traces of preserved chemicals and human tissue that were consistent with the processing activities O'Malley had described. As word of O'Malley's survival began to spread through the immigrant communities of Baltimore and Richmond, the Fairfax family's paranoia reached unprecedented levels. Margaret's journals from this period reveal a woman consumed by fear and rage at the prospect of exposure after so many years of successful operation. The family began making preparations for emergency evacuation while simultaneously planning desperate measures to discredit or eliminate O'Malley before she could testify in court. The network's corruption of local officials became a liability during this period as Webb's federal investigation revealed the extent of institutional compromise that had protected the operation. Several corrupt judges and law enforcement officers found themselves under federal investigation, while others began cooperating with Webb's team in hopes of reducing their own legal exposure. The systematic corruption that had been the family's greatest strength was rapidly becoming their most significant vulnerability. Edmund Fairfax's attempts to discredit O'Malley's testimony through his remaining medical and political connections proved futile against the mounting physical evidence and corroborating witness accounts that Webb continued to gather. The decades of careful reputation management and institutional manipulation that had protected the family were crumbling under sustained federal investigation supported by credible eyewitness testimony from a survivor whose courage had finally broken the wall of silence that had protected the network's murderous activities. The confrontation that would bring down the Fairfax network began at dawn on November 15, 1895, when Colonel Webb led a coordinated federal raid involving over 50 agents across multiple locations throughout Virginia and Maryland. The operation, planned with military precision, was designed to simultaneously strike the main estate and 17 secondary facilities before the family could implement their evidence destruction protocols. Webb had learned from Rebecca O'Malley's testimony that the family maintained emergency procedures for eliminating all traces of their activities within hours of detecting serious threats. The raid on the Fairfax estate itself revealed horrors that exceeded even Webb's worst expectations based on O'Malley's testimony. Federal agents discovered 19 living victims in various stages of systematic torture and dismemberment, their condition so severe that several required immediate emergency medical attention to survive. The basement facilities contained surgical equipment specifically designed for prolonging victim consciousness during procedures that served no legitimate medical purpose, along with preservation apparatus that had been used to process hundreds of human beings over the course of nearly 2 decades. Edmund Fairfax's immediate response to the raid demonstrated the calculating ruthlessness that had enabled his operation to flourish for so long. Rather than attempting to destroy evidence or flee, he began systematically murdering the surviving victims in a desperate attempt to eliminate witnesses who could provide testimony about specific procedures and crimes. Federal agents were forced to engage in armed confrontation to prevent Edmund from completing what he called final patient care, a euphemism for the execution of individuals who had survived months or years of systematic torture. Margaret Fairfax had been supervising the destruction of documentary evidence when federal agents breached the estate's main building. Her meticulous record-keeping, which had been essential to the operation's success, became the focus of a desperate race between her destruction efforts and the agents' attempts to preserve crucial evidence. The agents succeeded in recovering approximately 60% of Margaret's ledgers and correspondence, providing detailed documentation of victims, procedures, financial transactions, and network participants spanning the entire duration of the criminal enterprise. Thomas Fairfax's reaction to the federal raid revealed the full extent of his psychological transformation during years of participation in systematic murder. Rather than surrendering or attempting to flee, he barricaded himself in the estate's main laboratory with several surviving victims and attempted to conduct final experimental procedures even as federal agents surrounded the building. His actions during the raid demonstrated a complete dissociation from normal human empathy, as he appeared more concerned with completing his research than with the legal consequences of his crimes. The simultaneous raids on secondary facilities throughout the network revealed the true scope of the Fairfax operation and the level of corruption that had enabled it to operate without detection. Facilities in Baltimore, Norfolk, and Richmond contained evidence of ongoing criminal activities, while raids on the homes and offices of network participants uncovered additional documentation and physical evidence. Several corrupt officials attempted to destroy evidence or flee during the raids, providing additional confirmation of their participation in the criminal enterprise. Dr. Harrison Mills, the Philadelphia surgeon who had helped expand the network into a regional operation, was arrested at his private clinic while attempting to dispose of preserved human remains through the facility's incinerator. Mills's arrest led to the discovery of detailed correspondence with medical institutions throughout the Northeast, revealing that the network's reach extended far beyond what investigators had initially suspected. Several prestigious medical schools were found to have been purchasing specimens from the network for years, raising questions about the complicity of academic institutions in the systematic murder operation. The raid also uncovered evidence of the network's international connections when agents discovered shipping records documenting the export of human remains to buyers in Canada, England, and Germany. These international sales had generated enormous profits for the network while also creating diplomatic complications as foreign governments demanded information about the source of anatomical specimens that had been imported from American suppliers. Judge Hartwell's attempt to use his position on the state Supreme Court to interfere with the federal investigation backfired spectacularly when Webb's team discovered evidence of his corruption among the seized documents. Hartwell's communications with the Fairfax family revealed not only his financial relationship with the network but also his active participation in covering up evidence and intimidating potential witnesses. His arrest sent shockwaves through Virginia's legal establishment and demonstrated the federal government's commitment to pursuing justice regardless of the political consequences. The discovery of the network's elimination protocols during the raid revealed the systematic methods that had been used to silence potential witnesses and eliminate threats over the years. Federal agents found detailed plans for murdering Rebecca O'Malley along with lists of other individuals who had been targeted for elimination due to their knowledge of network activities. These documents provided evidence for dozens of additional murder charges and demonstrated the calculated nature of the family's efforts to maintain their operation through intimidation and violence. Dr. Thornton's arrest as the corrupt state medical examiner revealed how the network had manipulated official death investigations to conceal their crimes. Thornton's record showed that he had falsified cause-of-death determinations for network victims while also providing official documentation that facilitated the transportation and sale of human remains. His cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges provided crucial testimony about the institutional corruption that had protected the network. The evidence gathered during the raids painted a picture of systematic murder and corruption that exceeded anything previously documented in American criminal history. The Fairfax network had operated with virtual impunity for nearly 2 decades, protected by a web of corruption that extended into every level of Virginia's medical, legal, and political establishments. The federal investigation revealed that the network had been responsible for at least 200 confirmed murders, with the actual victim count likely being significantly higher due to the destruction of evidence and the systematic elimination of witnesses.